brain wars that
brain wars
triggered me for whatever reason. Tell me a little bit about that.
So Brain Wars is the title of my next book. And the title comes from the notion that there's actually a battle going on in your brain right now. Not just your brain, but I'm not picking on you.
Yeah.
That between basically good and evil, that we have cells in our brain, immune cells, they're called microglial cells. And, for decades, we've been looking at these cells and recognizing that they are the brain's immune system, the brain's innate immune system. They function as the way the brain protects itself from invading organisms, for example, as your body immune system works. And yet, we now recognize that while all the attention over many years has been on the neuron, the brain cell, the neuron, that a lot of attention needs to be directed towards the brain's immune cells, because these really dictate your brain's destiny. Whether, as you age, your brain's going to be along for the ride and let you participate in a life with cognitive reserve, emotional reserve, being able to participate in all the wonderful experiences that your life is going to present to you, or you will suffer from a neurodegenerative issue, which will threaten you and your loved ones.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that this one cell, you have, it's 10% of all the cells in your brain, but it's one type of cell, I should say, can vary between two types. The good twin that wants to nurture your brain and the evil twin that's set on destroying your brain. The same cell, the same DNA can change. And when it changes to be the evil cell, the evil twin, as it were, it digests away your neurons. It removes synapses, the way one neuron connects to the next. It threatens the very precious blood-brain barrier. And it really compromises your brain's ability to grow new brain cells by turning off the production of certain what we call trophic chemicals that lead normally to good growth of new brain cells. The empowering part of the whole discussion is that this battle between good and evil, between what are called the M1 microglia and the M2, the good microglia, is a battle over which our lifestyle choices carry incredible sway. We determine whether these cells are working with us or working against us. And in a very real way, then, we are determining our brain's destiny. We are up against a belief system that would have us think that we should just live our lives however we choose, and that when we suddenly begin to decline cognitively, there'll be a wonder drug out there for us and everything's going to be fine. Well, the reality is twofold. First, there is no wonder drug for that problem that's affecting now Alzheimer's, 6.8 million Americans. And number two, the changes that are happening with these microglial cells happen 20, 30 years before you begin to experience cognitive decline. So we've really got to get the messaging out that the choices we make in our 20s and 30s and 40s are powerfully influential and relevant as it relates to your brain's destiny. So, the message from me to you is your generation needs to pay attention to this. My generation desperately hopes that they did pay attention to it, but your generation, at your age, you're making choices right now that are going to last you a lifetime.
Yeah, it can be really empowering because it means all of the accountability and the responsibility is on you and the lifestyle choices that you make. But if you're not up for the task, it can also be debilitating, right? So I've always, I guess, for whatever reason, thought that genetics played such a big role in terms of diseases and brain. So what is the percentage, what is the percentage of likelihood if your mom had Alzheimer's versus the lifestyle choices that you can make and the impact of those?
Yeah, that's a fundamental question. And I will indicate to you that I would have answered that question differently 5 years ago. And we've known about certain genetic predispositions to developing Alzheimer's. Things like TREM2, TREM1, APOE4, for example. People may know what that means who've had their genetic testing done. And the standard discussion has been one focused on the notion that these increase your risk. But we now know that we can dramatically offset that risk. For example, we did say that if you carry the APO genotype, one allele of APOE4 would increase your risk of Alzheimer's and untreatable disease by about 5-fold. If you carry 2 alleles, your increased risk was 12-fold. A risk for a disease that you're going to have a 50% chance of getting anyway if you live to be age 85. So those numbers are daunting. I mean, to think you have a 12-fold increased risk for early onset Alzheimer's because you're APOE4, that's scary business. And interestingly, somebody asked me a question in a session I did at a conference recently, actually an hour ago, truth be known. I don't know how people know we're at a conference.
Yeah.
But, she said I had a certain test performed and it shows I'm at increased risk. And the response is, that's old school. That's old knowledge. That to get back to the guts of your question, that our lifestyle choices are hugely influential in terms of your brain's destiny. Manyfold more influential than simply the genetic predisposition. So we're moving away from genetic determinism. You carry this genetic profile, you're going to get X, Y, or Z, to a genetic predisposition saying, yeah, here's the part of the story you gotta take home. That is, you're at increased risk, and therefore you got to double down on making these changes. And that's the type of information we need to get out to the public.
Yeah, it's not information like you're hopeless, like you're likely going to get it. It's like you actually have more control now. You should be taking more action to be able to reduce the likelihood of that.
Totally, and that's new messaging. The messaging before is when you got back your whatever the genetic test was, you basically needed to get your wagons in a circle because you knew that things were coming soon and that was going to be a problem for you. That's not the messaging anymore, and I'm very happy about that because it hits the ball back across the net to your side of the court saying, look, that could be your destiny, but it really depends on how you return that serve. You know the information now, and we're now at a place where we can tell you exactly what it is that you need to be doing.
Talk to me about if we go back to our ancestors 10,000 years ago, what percentage of them do you think had brain disease?
I think very, very few. I mean, think of it this way. What we saw 10,000 years ago was a very close matchup between evolution and environment. What do I mean by that? We have honed our DNA to allow us to survive. That's what it wants us to do because our DNA wants to survive. So it's going to do everything to keep Sean going so that you can reproduce and you can just pass on the DNA to further generations. That DNA was refined in juxtaposition to a pretty invariable set of environmental circumstances, cues. Environment, not just how cold it is, how hot it is, how clean is the environment, but more so lifestyle issues, the amount of activity in which we engage, the amount of sleep that we would get, the quality of our sleep, and importantly, the foods that we would eat. So when Loren Cordain brought to us the notion of a paleo diet, he did so in an attempt to really shine a light on the notion that if we can eat in the way that our ancestors ate, our Paleolithic ancestors, it would line up with the messaging, the signals that our DNA expects to get in order to keep us healthy. The problem is that in recent years, we have absolutely turned the table on the signaling that we are giving to our DNA. So it's not a question of nature versus nurture. It's not a question of environment or genes. It's the dance between the two. It's the dance that our DNA undergoes and experiences as it is confronted by or greets or is exposed to our environment. Well, we're not going to rewrite our genetic code. We can talk about how we can influence epigenetically what's going on with our DNA, a different discussion. But we sure as heck can influence our environment by the choices that we make. Some things in our environment these days are hard to avoid, but the big players, the heavy lifting is done by the foods that we eat, the exercise we get or don't get, the amount of sleep and the quality of that sleep, that's for sure.
Talk to me about food. If you compare what our ancestors ate tens of thousands of years ago, and if you break down the percentage, I think you have this in your book around fat, carbs, protein, and what it is in our modern diet on average, what are the major differences you would say?
Let me first respond to you by saying that the diet that we are consuming on this planet now is sending signals to our physiology and our DNA, the likes of which it is ill-prepared to deal with. And that's really kind of fundamental, that we're sending these signals to our life code, and the messaging is interpreted in ways that are just destroying our health. So basically the question is then, what did our ancestors eat? They ate animal products. They ate a mostly plant-based diet, because when we say hunter-gatherer, really we should say more hunter-forager, in that we would hunt and kill animals and eat them and eat the entire animal, the bones, the marrow, name it, the fat, importantly, we'll talk about that. But a lot of what we ate was what we would find. I mean, we didn't have agriculture yet, that hadn't been developed. So it would basically be what we would find on the ground. And importantly, as a side note, is that a lot of the foods that we would eat would be rotting. And that was a good thing. I'm not advocating for your viewers go out and eat rotting food, but what happens when food is rotting? It's basically fermenting.
Right.
So we're getting at the notion of, in many ways, fermenting, as you know, preserves food. So what I'm saying is this process of a food self-degrading is a time when it's really rich in bacteria. There's a lot of metabolites that are being formed in that. Certainly rotting food can be threatening, but especially vegetables, high sugar vegetables, when they are rotting, they are fermenting. We've all eaten things like that. In a sense, in the first time you drank kombucha, you thought, you sort of rejected it a little bit because it has that trigger to your mind that this food isn't fresh. But that's because it's a fermented food. And that's been part of Korean tradition for an awful long time, to eat kimchi. And you're basically eating an awful lot of bacteria. You're loading your body with bacteria. So, the diet was very high in carbohydrate. That might raise eyebrows. Why? Because it was very high in fiber. So people say, I'm on a low-carb diet. And if you're strictly low-carb, you're avoiding fiber-rich foods. Bad idea in terms of the microbiome. But when people look at their total carbohydrate consumption, they should be factoring fiber in so they get an understanding in terms of carbs. But our ancestors ate clearly a lot more fat, however much protein they could find, but protein was cycled based upon the kill or what they found. But primarily, a major difference that isn't talked about, and everybody's talking about what was the percentage of fat and carbs in the diet. If you want, be more keto, you eat more fat and less carbs. I get all that. But I think the biggest change, and I think perhaps one of the most threatening changes, comparing the modern diet to primitive diet or Paleolithic diet, is that the fiber content has been so dramatically reduced. The estimates are that our Paleolithic ancestors consumed about 100 to 110 grams of fiber each day.
Where do they get the fiber from?
Plants.
Plants, okay.
Eating plants, eating tubers, eating things like that for survival. And I'm not sure, I was going to say your next question is going to be, but you told me your next question. But I thought maybe your next question would be, well, gee, how do we know that? How can we tell what our Paleolithic ancestors? It's an interesting question. And how the science is done involves looking at what are called fecaliths. Fecal, people know what fecal is. Lith means stone. So we're looking at actually fossilized Paleolithic ancestral poop. And we could look at that fossilized poop and we could see the DNA, the preservation of DNA that can tell us not just that they ate a lot of plants, but what the plants actually were, and evidence within that of fiber as well. We can also look at the calcium, the tartar, or the calculus rather, in their teeth, surrounding their teeth. That's why we get our teeth cleaned every 6 months. They remove the calculus. That's calcified bacteria. So we can actually infer from that data by looking at the DNA of this calculus that they removed from our ancestors' teeth, what their oral microbiomes were made of. That's pretty incredible science.
Interesting.
And that has remained really very constant for tens of thousands of years and very much emulates what we're seeing in non-industrialized populations and the planet right now, and is incredibly different from what we see in most people.
It's interesting. So you're saying back, because I guess most people think about it as like, oh, once you turn 70, no matter what your diet is, you are susceptible to potential brain disease. I always thought with ancestors, they just didn't live that long, so they didn't have even the age, related diseases because a lot of them just died before 50.
What did they die of?
I guess they were killed oftentimes.
Well,
right?
That's one thing. They were killed by others, by warring others, or from animals, or from trauma.
Yeah.
They fell out of a tree, or they, when we say that our Paleolithic ancestors didn't have longevity, and we're living so much longer now because of all the advances in medicine, that's ridiculous. The reason it's the average. The average lifespan back then was a lot shorter. I'll give you that.
Yeah.
We didn't have ERs. We didn't have ways of treating sepsis. They. And if you factored in the number of children who died during childhood or during birth, and the women who would die during childbirth, that brought that number way, way down. So, women in childbirth, by definition, they're going to be in their teens and 20s. So it brings that number, the average number, way down. But when you look at the dentition of our Paleolithic ancestors, you're impressed by two things. Number one, they had gorgeous teeth.
Right.
Beautiful dentition. And number two, some of them were octogenarians, nonagenarians, and there were some long-living individuals.
Yeah, I guess they just didn't find out. You couldn't, people just died from the Ice Age or they were killed, so it's hard to know. Interesting points. What is the ideal diet then?
Well, I think some would say, how did Dr. Perlmutter answer that question? Did he make a personalized medicine recommendation, or did he give the broad strokes? And actually, I'll do both.
Okay.
I think that it's a personalized approach if we are looking at biometrics and specifically things like blood glucose. And I would say to you, the perfect diet for you, or one important parameter, would be what is the dietary scheme for Sean that is really kind to your blood sugar. So if you were wearing a continuous glucose monitor and you were to give me the report from the past month or so, and we looked at what you were eating, I would say, whatever you're doing, keep doing it, or whatever you're doing, whoa, that needs to stop, and right now, because look at your blood sugar, look at the area under the curve on your CGM. So that's a personalized approach. On the other hand, the big broad stroke appeal I would make would be, make sure your diet is very, very high in dietary fiber. Eat a lot of plants, number one. I'm not saying be exclusively a plant-based diet. Number two, welcome good fats back to the table. And number three, make sure that you're avoiding foods that are going to raise your blood sugar. In our society, in America, for example, about 60% of calories in the standard American diet, SAD, and indeed it is sad, 60% of calories right now are coming from ultra-processed foods. These are foods that have a long shelf life, are devoid of any meaningful nutrients, and do nothing but more than threaten your blood sugar, your metabolic health. For me as a neurologist, that is rule number one in terms of a diet to recommend for people to avoid if you want to have a long-lived, healthy brain. So again, the broad stroke recommendation is reduce your consumption of these ultra-processed foods. The personalized approach would be avoid foods that for you are raising your blood sugar.
And you need a continuous glucose monitor. That's really the only way to know, because you test.
And again, I would say you should do that. You need not do it all the time. Once you've done a CGM and recognize that this particular approach is raising my blood sugar, but when I do this and I exercise in the morning or in the evening and I get a good night's sleep, more than just food has a role to play in your blood sugar, that my blood sugar looks really good and this is what I should continue doing. Point I just made, I want to emphasize, and that is, as it relates to this fundamental inroad to good metabolism, keeping your blood sugar under control, there's more to the story than just your foods that you choose and the type of diet that you're alluding to. That sleep quality and duration are critical for regulating insulin functionality and therefore your blood sugar. Exercise also similarly targets pathways in your body like AMP kinase that help regulate your blood sugar and keep you metabolically intact. These are all really important inroads to controlling your metabolism, and that's where it's at. And it's not just the brain, but it's heart health, it's immune health, it's cancer risk reduction, it's across the board.
This is a little bit off track, but my hypothesis is like if my ancestors likely have eaten stuff like rice for whatever thousands and thousands of years, is it likelihood that I'm more adaptable to
Yes.
eating something like rice? Is that like out of crazy theory, or is that
No.
likely? Yeah.
20 years ago, it would have been on the crazy scale. 40 years ago, it would have been crazy. Yeah, so we now recognize that environmental exposures change your epigenome, and I'll unpack that at some point, change the way markers on your DNA allow that DNA to express itself, and that is transmissible, more so in men related to you if you're as a father of children than in women.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it is actually, at least in the rodent model, expressed 4 generations down the line. So if you ultimately adapted yourself to being tolerant of rice, that your ultimately future generations, your progeny, would become more able to tolerate that.
Interesting.
It's breathtaking. I mean, it really is breathtaking.
Wow. So it's true then. Does that mean though, if we're a society where we're eating ultra processed foods, could that mean over generations we're just more adaptable to eating sugar and having it less impacted?
That's an
That's the
interesting
crazy
question.
part.
I
Maybe
should
this is the
answer.
crazy
I should
part.
answer no, because it's
Because
you know,
if what you're saying is true about rice, shouldn't the same thing be about sugar and some of the bad things?
Yeah, and as it relates to rice, I think we're talking about the digestion, and perhaps as it relates to your metabolism. It's hard for me to imagine that there will be any upside to any significant degree. I'm not going to say no degree, but to any significant degree in terms of the ability to adapt to poisoning your body, as it were.
Yeah.
I mean, the cultivars of rice that your ancestors may have eaten had reasonable levels of good nutrition and had fiber. And, truly were not hugely related to spiking of blood sugar. But the processing of rice into rice products is relatively newer, and it's what releases blood sugar more readily, and it is what strips rice of its nutritional value, even its fiber value.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Okay, so going on to brain health, what are the superfoods that we should all be consuming that our brain loves? Like, what's something that can protect our brains and keep
Sure.
it functioning well?
So the brain is 70% dry weight fat. It is built from the fat that you eat. Now, people oftentimes have this concept of, the organs in my body respond to my food choices, lifestyle choices, and now I've heard that even my brain, responds. And the point what I'm making here is that it shouldn't be the organs in my body. Oh, and by the way, my brain. The brain is an organ in your body. It's just as much stuff as your liver is stuff, and everything else is stuff. It's made from what you eat. The brain certainly reflects what your emotional status is, what your exposures are in terms of learning, cognition, et cetera. But the raw material from which your brain is made are those raw materials that you inhale or eat. Think about that. Now, I just preface this by saying 70% of your brain's dry weight is fat. Therefore, the type of fat that you consume is front and center, fundamentally important for building a better brain. What's happened in the past 100 years is we've introduced bad fats into the human diet. A lot in the Western world and a whole lot here in America. In the late 1800s, Procter & Gamble, a company, began exploring using cotton seeds to actually create oils. And they started expelling the oil from seeds and created cottonseed oil. Couldn't really find much use for it. And suddenly, as they were doing this, a sludge came out of the squeezing of these cotton seeds, really thick sludge, and they purified it a little bit, and they turned it into something called Crisco. And Crisco became a substitute for lard in cooking and in food preparation thereafter across America. The other thing is, well, as an aside, Procter & Gamble was making soap at the time, and they needed lard to make the soap, to render it. And then they developed Crisco, which became okay for humans to eat. Wow. Very strange. But thereafter, many seeds were used to create oil and really entered the notion of being good for us, especially in the 1960s when we began to relate fat consumption to the development of atherosclerosis. So there was a great push at that point to begin eating more seed oils because they weren't animal-based, because animal oils and fats were higher in what we call saturated fats and were thought to be the demon. Animal fats that you and I just talked about, what humans have been eating for tens of thousands of years, suddenly science told us, no more animal fats, no more eggs, no more meat, no more lard, no more butter.
Who's the guy who was on like Time Magazine? He's the guy that kind of like...
Ansel Keys.
That's what it is.
Yes.
Yes.
So Ansel Keys was fundamental in that, perversion of data, the cherry picking of nations in terms of correlating their fat consumption with cardiac risk of coronary artery disease. And yet that stood the test of time, because then the food industry could amplify their production, therefore the sale of these plant-based, or more precisely seed-based oils, corn oil, safflower oil, canola oil. And we were led to believe that these were better choices than animal-based fats and oils. And to this day, we still see evidence of that. Go to any restaurant and have breakfast, and you'll see an option to have egg white omelet. Because one fat that is contained in the egg yolk is something called cholesterol, which your body desperately needs to make progesterone and estrogen and testosterone and vitamin D. So the notion that cholesterol is a bad thing is something that I think we have to challenge, especially dietary cholesterol. 80% of the cholesterol in your body is made by your own liver.
Right.
I have to say, for crying out loud, because it's an eyebrow raiser again. So
is there studies, by the way, like dietary cholesterol, like yolk, not having an impact on actual blood cholesterol?
Plenty of studies have indicated that. And the yolk is where we have a lot of choline, for example, and the brain loves choline. This notion of building a brain with better fats means, first of all, take out the seed oils from your diet and replace those seed oils with good fats, like saturated fats that your body loves. And then there are some specific fats like DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, and EPA, that are building blocks for the membranes over brain cells themselves and other cells of the brain. There are more cells in the brain than just brain cells. So these are very important. I think you were getting at, what are those superfoods?
What are the specific fats?
Yeah, so I would say that, my favorite is going to be DHA. DHA, not just, there's three reasons I like it. Number one, and people can buy DHA in the grocery store or online, whatever.
It's like omega-3.
It is in the omega-3 family. But it enhances the body's production of a trophic hormone to make new brain cells, to strengthen the existing brain cells, and to make new synapses or connections between brain cells. That's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. The next thing it does is it is a COX-2 inhibitor. What does that mean? It reduces inflammation. That's really important for the brain. And the third thing is DHA is really important structurally for building a better brain. So next question, how much should you take? And I think at a minimum, I would be taking, I am at least a minimum, taking 1,000 milligrams a day of DHA. So
1,000, okay.
But oftentimes I'll recommend a lot more. When there's an existing problem, neurodegenerative issue, we go a lot higher. Autism, we go a lot higher. Various clinical states, recommendations much higher. But having said that, when you buy your fish oil or a product and it says this capsule is 2,000 milligrams, you need to check the DHA content of that. Because that doesn't mean 2,000 milligrams of DHA just because it's krill oil or it's fish oil or it's algae-derived a product. You want to see how much actual DHA on the label is it containing. It may only contain 500 milligrams of DHA, whatever. So you want to bump up. That would be per capsule. You take 2 capsules of that minimum.
Got it. Got it. EHA, is there an amount that you recommend?
Yeah, and I like a similar amount or slightly more of the EPA.
Yeah. Got it.
Eicosapentaenoic acid, yeah. So generally these products have a higher level of EPA, also very important. And we're actually seeing DPA now found in various omega-3s, docosapentaenoic acid. And that's important because it's kind of like a storage depot from which DHA can be harvested. So you're now starting to see DPA containing oils as well. So again, on the brain superfood list, the types of fats we avoid and the types of fats we consume are really paramount in terms of building that more resilient brain that is structurally and functionally sound, and providing those fats that help provide an environment for the immune system to work more efficiently as well.
Yeah. How do you compare the differences of supplementing your DHA and omega-3 in general versus taking it through food like salmon? Is it more important that we focus on the food portions and maybe the supplementation is just like a nice to have?
I think it's a very important discussion. And, my mentality is one that kind of gravitates to getting these particulars in their natural form. We talk about what's called the entourage effect. It's not just that the movie star comes in, but the movie star comes in with all of her entourage. And that's really helpful for making sure everything works well, right?
Yeah.
That the performance goes very well. And so it is with foods that we eat. That, yeah, you can take a polyphenol-rich food, for example, and compare that to just taking a capsule of polyphenols or quercetin or something. That the environment in which it's delivered is more allows this thing to really amplify its functionality. To your point about salmon, I have a sense, though I'll argue the other side as well, so I don't have to commit. One has a sense that eating salmon, because of the various other things in non-farm raised salmon that you will get, is a good idea then, because of the quality of that protein, other fats that may be present in that food, the carotenoids that make the salmon pink, the calcium that's going to be in the bones that you will inevitably eat and should, carefully, I guess I should say, and perhaps even the skin. So having said that, I think there's got to be value in this entourage effect. Having said that, I can't get good wild salmon everywhere I go when I travel, for example. Though I did bring back a huge cooler of salmon frozen from fishing all summer long.
Hey.
So that's going to last me for a little while.
Nice.
But I would say for that reason, I supplement. I take fish oil capsules when I travel.
Is there a brand that you specifically like?
There are several that are out there that are very good. There's a company called Big Bold Health that has wonderful fish oils. There's also the doctor formulated brand that's available in health food stores and on Amazon.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, they both source from the same resource in Alaska, where there has been a judicious approach to harvesting that oil out of cod. So good brands.
Yeah. Because I guess what I don't want is like for people to just rely on supplemental form
I agree with you.
well, because they think they just take the omega-3s and then they don't eat salmon or avocados.
Well, you could take plenty of omega-3s and get no DHA.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because sometimes they don't contain.
Yeah, I mean,
DHA,
omega-3 is a pretty large category.
Yeah.
So, again, getting back to our discussion, look at your supplement, make sure it's got the DHA, because if you're going to value what Dr. Perlmutter has to say, that's a key, getting back to our discussion about the superfoods for the brain.
Yeah, got it. Going back to what our ancestors had to deal with and some of the modern toxins and technologies that we have to deal with today that just was not dealt with our ancestors. A good example is Bluetooth AirPods or just our technologies and us sleeping next to our phones. Like, how much of an impact has there been studies around that, around what our brain health is being impacted based on these new technologies, like wearing AirPods and the electromagnetic fields that are coming in? What are some of the studies that have been done around the impacts of that with modern technology?
Of
modern
non-ionizing radio frequency?
Yeah, just in general technology and the impacts it could have on our brains.
So when cell phones first came out, I'm not sure you were born, but maybe you were.
Cell phones?
Yeah,
I had the
okay.
flip phones.
Well, even way before flip phones, when they were about this big.
Probably. I didn't have access
And you had to
it.
have a separate thing with a briefcase with a battery. Anyway, in the day. There was some concern that it was a lot of radiation. And, I had 2 patients within a week come into my office with malignant brain tumors saying, I hold my phone, that type of phone right here. Could there be any connection? And I thought, well, I don't think so. I mean, otherwise, how would the FCC and other organizations approved our use of these things? And then I learned, interestingly, that there was really no science behind the approval process, and that there was some evidence that this non-ionizing radiation could be damaging. I mean, we say non-ionizing because it's not like X-ray radiation. It's more in the microwave frequency. And I began looking at the animal studies, and they were worrisome. And the next thing I know, I was on I don't know if there's still a show called 2020. That used to be a very popular show talking about this stuff. And there was a bit of a step back, and actually had to testify in a class action suit against one of the manufacturers. I think with time, more research in humans has indicated that probably there isn't any direct relationship between holding the cell phone up towards by your head, as one would need to, and risk of tumorigenesis. Having said that, then you bring up the notion of the earbuds, which are even closer. I mean, they're right in your ears, which I use.
And you're using it all day.
I'm not using it all day.
Well,
I use it on the treadmill or Precor.
Yeah.
That's a brand. Elliptical machine, sorry. They're as convenient as the day is long. I think it's not unreasonable to use the speaker on your smartphone and find a quiet place and speak and work that way. And oddly enough, we have something at home called a landline. I know it's a stretch, but we have them all over the house. And I think I'm not going to say, because it wouldn't be forthright, that we have them because of my concern over the radiation. I have them because we just were too lazy to get rid of them. And it's the phone number that everybody knows. And it actually, when we have bad cell service, it's a good backup plan. So there you go.
Got it. Okay. The other thing, though, is if you're thinking about like 5G and how powerful these technologies are getting, I get there's no studies around it, but it only has been around for so long. I don't know what's going to happen in 15 or 20 years.
I agree with you. And I'm not sure necessarily that 5G is that much more powerful. I think it is, to the extent that there are a lot more 5G transmitters and receivers around that you've noticed. I personal experience with it, but I've seen since 5G that my signal quality has declined. It's been, just as an aside. But I think that your point is that we don't know what the future will hold. It's one big experiment. This whole thing with challenging human physiology with the type of diet that we're consuming is a very big experiment that is being played upon us without informed consent. Having said that, I think another big experiment that we might talk about is the widespread use of drugs called GLP-1 agonists, like Ozempic.
I want to talk about that,
there's not a day goes by that we don't see some new disease added to the list of things for which people taking Ozempic are either having a reduced risk of getting or improving from. I think the most recent one, as of 2 days ago, was arthritic knee pain. Much improved in people taking semaglutide or Ozempic.
Can you maybe there's people that don't know, what is GLP-1 exactly?
So GLP-1 is a peptide that is made in cells called the L cells in the small intestine. And it's a peptide that is secreted when we consume foods. And what that does is it helps us know that we're eating. It informs our body that we're consuming foods. It helps to reduce the way the stomach is able to empty, so we feel more satiated or full. It signals the metabolism throughout the body to improve how we deal with glucose. And now we see that these receptors for that peptide are found throughout the body, even found throughout the brain, as it were, and trigger improved metabolism. Actually are able to improve the function of the mitochondria, reduce inflammation, at least in the diabetic patients. And now we're getting to see studies, because they've been around for a few years, at least in the treatment of diabetes, that show, in comparison to non-users of these drugs, those who are using them have a reduced risk of Alzheimer's if they're diabetic by 40 to 70%. That study was published about 10 days ago. And even in individuals who were given these drugs in a trial versus a placebo who had Parkinson's disease, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in May of this year, 2024, showed that Parkinson's over a 3-year period of time was stopped dead in its tracks. I am not having this conversation with you today to be an advocate to say that all patients with Parkinson's immediately go out and get a script for Ozempic, because truthfully, it wasn't Ozempic even that was studied. It was a different GLP-1 agonist called liraglutide, or Victoza, but that be used because it more easily crosses the blood-brain barrier. The point I'm making, and why I'm bringing it up, is this is a drug or a class of drugs that improves metabolism. We can talk about how we can improve your metabolism right now and not have to have an injection.
You feel that's the primary thing then? It's not this magical drug, it's just that this controls your blood sugar levels and metabolism, and that's really what causes a lot of brain disease.
Yes.
And we can control that in different ways without relying. It's just that it's obviously...
Well, look, we've been messaged over the past few years that Alzheimer's, for example, is caused by the accumulation in the brain of a particular protein called beta amyloid, the amyloid hypothesis. And more recently, drugs have been produced to either target the formation of this amyloid or actually rid the brain of the amyloid to treat Alzheimer's disease. And the FDA has approved them, and they don't work, and they are to any significant degree. When you look at 18 months out, which was published last year in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most popular drugs, it slowed the disease down, but people still fell off the cliff. Slowed it down by 3 months, at the risk of about 20 to 30% increased risk of brain hemorrhaging, and almost 100% of the people taking the drugs had shrinkage of their brain, something that a patient concerned about cognitive decline can ill afford.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, we contrast that with our topic, and that is the notion that we now recognize that the fundamental in the Alzheimer's brain is not the accumulation of beta amyloid. We know that there are lots of patients who have very little beta amyloid and basically decline cognitively at a rapid rate. We don't know why, aside from their metabolic issues. And we also know that there are plenty of patients whose brains are loaded with beta amyloid and are cognitively intact. So beyond the fact that the original data related to beta amyloid was flawed and in fact was falsified, that just came out in Nature, there's a lot of reasons to doubt this as being the reason people get Alzheimer's disease. It is not. Primarily, it's a metabolic issue of the brain, which reflects your body-wide metabolism, which is something you can control. Connect those dots, and I just told you, you can control your risk for Alzheimer's by controlling your body's metabolism. But we go back to these GLP-1 agonist drugs like Ozempic. I bring it up only as an example of the importance of metabolism. These drugs target metabolism. Metabolism is things like overweight and obesity, hypertension, elevated blood sugar with insulin resistance. These are the things, mitochondrial function, that are improved by these types of drugs. But we don't necessarily need to revert to the use of these drugs to help an individual's metabolism.
But so the same thing could be going for metformin, right? Which is also supposed to be helpful for that.
There is an ongoing study right now being conducted looking at the use of metformin as a way of treating Alzheimer's disease. That's correct.
Interesting. So just for people who are aware with GLP-1, what are the long-term potential downsides, if there are any, just because it's fairly typed out pretty much. I don't know how much information there is out there. What are the long-term risks for what you know?
Here's the answer, which is stunning. No one knows. The reason that's stunning and bothersome is we sure as heck should know before 4% of the global population is given these drugs, which is what's happening right now.
Which is, yeah, and it's going to get to 10%. And
of course it will be.
Just,
I mean, it's
wild.
Quick fix. Eat what you want, or think whatever you want to eat, you're going to eat, because now you're not going to eat that.
Yeah.
But having said that, it's a grand experiment. And when we look at other experiences with long-term usage of various types of drugs in the past, that we didn't know things until 5, 10, 20 years down the line, or the progeny of people using these drugs. What happens to them? We do not have the answer to that.
Yeah.
Well, there are animal studies. Now people have been on these drugs for a few years and nothing's happened yet. Well, the reality is things have happened. Things are already happening that should make us take pause. And the fact is, to reiterate what you said, we just don't know long-term where we're going with this. And to consider the notion that, millions of people are taking these drugs and don't know the answer to the question, that's worrisome to me.
Yeah. And I've seen people talk about, there are no side effects. It's like, how do you know that? You just don't know. There's not enough time. And I feel like we're running numerous different experiments, 5G experiment, the EMF experiment, and 100 years from now, I feel like we're gonna find some stunning information.
Well,
I hope we don't, but
sooner than that. There's a slide in one of my presentations, and it's just a cartoon. A woman's looking out the window, and there's a man falling, and he's right at her level. He's falling, and he says, "But I feel fine." He's going to hit the ground real soon.
Any second now.
And it gets back to what I said earlier about the metabolic changes in the brain that presage Alzheimer's begin 20 to 30 years ahead of time.
Yeah.
Those are when the signatures can be determined on advanced types of metabolic brain scanning, like scans that look at glucose utilization. Those changes begin 20 to 30 years prior. That's your generation. Prior to the beginnings of the cognitive forgetfulness, my grandchildren's names, much less the Wi-Fi code and all these things, right?
Yeah.
And John Kennedy said that the time to fix a roof is when the sun is shining. We are practicing reactive medicine. When I say we, I mean general, way medicine's practice. Reactive. You've got a problem now, I'll just reach into the drug closet, bring you something out. It reminds me of the last part of The Wizard of Oz. They each, the Tin Man and the Scarecrow and Dorothy all have their problems, and he reaches in and brings them each something. We need to be proactive and keep people healthy. That's the answer. The Neijing, the Yellow Emperor in Chinese medicine, 4th century BC, said that prevention is the ultimate principle of wisdom. To cure a disease after it has manifest is like digging a well when one feels thirsty or forging weapons when the war has already begun. The war is ongoing for many people. For others, the war has not already begun. So, the actual cognitive decline that people experience that is an indication of dementia, most likely Alzheimer's. That may have not started yet in many people, but there's storm clouds brewing on the horizon if your blood sugar is not under control, if you're overweight, if you have hypertension. And the risk of those storm clouds brewing has a genetic component, and that's something people should know about.
What are the, you mentioned you can start to see these effects from your biomarkers 23 years beforehand. Is that something you can get in a lab to know certain levels?
Yes. You can immediately determine your state of metabolic health. A lot of different laboratory studies are indicative of that. I find that knowing your glucose monitor results is probably at the top of the list.
That's one of the top. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are now something called phosphorylated tau 279, which many common labs are able to give you, and others 217. But the fact is that these laboratory studies are an indication of the reflection of those metabolic changes in your brain. So now, you're metabolically non-intact, and is it starting to manifest as changes? So having said that, things like A1C, right? You've heard of A1C. People commercial on TV. I'm taking this drug because I'm going to control my A1C. My A1C is below 7. Well, Alzheimer's risk begins at an A1C of 5.5. On TV, we're told, well, if you get your A1C below 7, magically something happens. It's a binary shift. It's not like being pregnant, whether you are or you are not. This is a scale that isn't binary. This is having an A1C of 6.8 is better than 7.0. 5.8 is much better. 5.5 even better. What's it an indication of? A couple of things are really important on that blood test in particular. So This is not esoteric by any means. It's an indication first of your overall blood sugar control, a marker of overall blood sugar control in a crude way. But secondly, what is A1C? A1C is called hemoglobin A1C, or glycated hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, your listeners will know, is a protein in your red blood cells that's involved in carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide. It's what carries the carbon dioxide to your lungs. You let it go, you breathe it out. Oxygen from the lungs, you breathe it in, carried in the red blood cell. So we all know what hemoglobin is. When hemoglobin, over a period of months, is exposed to higher levels of blood sugar, it becomes bound to that sugar. We call it glycation. And it becomes an advanced glycation end product. I mention that because the acronym is AGE, age, fundamental for aging. So when that A1C is elevated, it's telling you, yes, your blood sugar is elevated over time, but that your proteins throughout your body are being modified, not just the hemoglobin, A1C. All your proteins are binding that glucose and are being modified to the extent that that becomes a signal to your immune system that something's foreign in your body, and it ramps up the production of chemicals that are typically increased when something's foreign in your body. We call these inflammatory cytokines. So there's a connection then between having a high A1C and the level of inflammation in your body. That gets back to your point about what are these lab tests that we can get that give us a sense as to, are we challenging our metabolic health? And A1C is anything but esoteric or unique. I mean, that you have to go to specialty lab for that. So there are wonderful laboratory studies out there. One of the best things that an individual can do is buy a very expensive device and have it at home. You can now get this, a couple of them actually. One is called a tape measure. Believe it or not.
Measure.
A tape measure.
Okay.
It's a very technical tool.
Yeah.
And you put it around your belly and you see how big is your belly.
Got it.
And that is an immediate indication as to your state of metabolic health and your risk for brain degeneration.
Interesting. Okay.
Yep.
So
And
that's
a
good
bathroom
factor.
scale.
Yeah.
So you don't even need a laboratory study.
So A1C, that's for inflammation. And then what is the marker name for glucose?
Glucose, blood glucose.
Is it just glucose? It's not like a special term
typically
for it?
they'll get a fasting blood glucose
level.
FBG, fasting blood glucose.
Yeah.
But again, that's a snapshot.
Yeah.
That was what your blood sugar was this morning after a 12-hour fast.
Right. You don't know what you ate yesterday. And
Well,
that could impact
and it turns out that last night you had a really tough time going to sleep because you were thinking about getting your a blood draw, and you freak out about that, right?
Yeah.
The fact that you didn't sleep last night means your blood sugar is going to be erroneously high. Or if you're constantly not sleeping well, that's going to be your average. Average blood sugar will be higher, or fasting blood sugar is going to be higher. There are a lot of factors that play into what is that one-time snapshot you get every year for your annual physical. It's almost meaningless.
Okay.
That said, having a continuous glucose monitor gives you data on your blood sugar throughout the course of the day, reflective of your lifestyle choices beyond eating. We talked about it. And you get a real sense over a month or two of using CGM as to what's going on. Where am I on the scale of being metabolically healthy? If you're like probably 90+% of Americans, you are not metabolically healthy. That's a daunting statistic, isn't it? That at least 90% of American adults, and I would say almost with adolescents as well, have at least one of the markers of metabolic syndrome, whether it's the blood pressure issue, the elevated blood sugar, insulin resistance markers, the dyslipidemia, the various markers of metabolic compromise.
Yeah. Where do you get the continuous glucose? Do you have a brand specifically, or do you just go to any pharmacy?
The best place to go is called Levels Health. Levelshealth.com.
Yes. Okay.
And they'll figure it out how you can get ACGM, and they have a terrific app that allows you to track your blood sugar and input your food choices. And the technology that will soon be here is the ability just to take a picture of your plate.
Yeah.
It'll look at all the foods, it'll measure the quantity, and input that. It's where we're going. With AI influenced availability on these apps is going to be quite remarkable.
Just to close off, I want to talk to you a little bit about nootropics. I'm obviously doing podcasts like this. I'd love to stay sharp, take lion's mane, all these different things. What is the impact of that on the brain? Is that a good thing to be constantly taking these different supplement pills?
I think it depends on which we're talking about. I mean,
lion's mane.
Let's talk about lion's mane.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by lion's mane, if that's where we take our conversation, because it is really influential among many things that it does. Actually, interventional trials in people who are cognitively dysfunctional has shown some stabilization and possibly even some improvement using lion's mane intervention. But having said that, what fascinates me is that that lion's mane has now been shown in experimental animals to reprogram those brain immune cells back from being the evil twin to being the good twin. In other words, reprogramming them away from that type of cell that's going to destroy brain cells, destroy the synapses, create an environment that's not good for brain cells, that increases the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, to doing just the opposite, going back to what's called the M2 phenotype, or the good twin, to nurture the brain cells, to enhance growth of new brain cells. Who wouldn't want that? To nurture the synapses and keep them intact, to repair the blood-brain barrier. So to me, that's probably the most interesting thing that I'm all over right now as it relates to lion's mane.
So lion's mane is one of your favorite nootropics that you
Yes.
think. Yeah, and we just bought some lion's mane mushrooms at Sprouts, and there's this guy on YouTube that makes these. He's a vegan chef, and he makes these like incredible lion's mane steaks at this vegan restaurant. I'm gonna link that down for people to check.
So you actually bought a supplement, or you bought the actual lion's mane?
We bought the actual. First time ever having it raw, and we cooked it, and it was so delicious.
Yeah.
We had it with steak sauce and everything. Oh my God, it was incredible, and I feel like really good today. I don't know if that's because of
Do you forage?
Forage?
Forage? Do you
What's
ever
that?
go out in the woods and look for mushrooms?
I have friends that do, but I travel so much that I haven't really done that.
I bet if you were to do it, you would find it very attractive, and you would maybe change your travel a little bit, or give yourself an extra day if you happen to be in the Pacific Northwest, for example, in the fall.
Okay.
It's really connecting. It's just the best. I mean, we've been doing a lot over the past few years, identifying various, and here's the important warning, that is, make sure you know what you're doing with somebody in terms of the mushrooms that you pick and then eat.
Yeah.
But once you're comfortable with that, oh my gosh, it's just the best.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, you're really reconnecting with the forest, but you're finding these mushrooms growing and you're bringing them home, and it's a deep connection. They're really very salubrious, the ones that you find and eat.
We're already talking about mushrooms, so I have to go there, which is what is the effects of psilocybin, shrooms, as they call it, other impacts or other factors like LSD and all these, what is psychedelics in general? What are the impacts of the brain for someone taking
Well,
it?
let me first say, if you interview Paul Stamets,
I would love to, yeah.
don't say shrooms. He doesn't like that term.
It's like bro science.
I know, shrooms. You'll lose a friend. But I would say that we're in, I would say, an early stage, not a nascent stage. So it's out. It's happening. And first-class research at top institutions is happening, demonstrating the efficacy in terms of actual interventional treatment of previously very challenging issues. So I'm just thrilled with that research is going on. I'm liking what I'm seeing with respect to the use of hallucinogens in the interventional approach to treating
MDMA,
dementia.
Yeah.
But I think that aside from the experience, the psychedelic experience, that what is interesting to me is what's going on with respect to exposure to these chemicals and positive changes to brain programming in terms of the innate immune system within the brain. And that's just being teased apart right now. So I think it's so unfortunate we got so set back, by the war on drugs.
Yeah.
And because, back in the 60s, there was great research happening, great strides were being made. And then, came a particular presidency where drugs were just categorized as drugs or drug life or no drug. Taking drugs, heroin and these hallucinogens that these hippies are taking, was all categorized in one silo. And it's unfortunate because it set us back by decades. And I'm very encouraged as to what I'm seeing now in terms of the research and in terms of states changing their laws to allow, under certain circumstances, the use of these interventions.
Yeah. So obviously you're not recommending, just want to be clear, you're not recommending anyone to do psilocybins or anything like that for the brain health. That's been clear. There's just not enough studies right now for you to recommend.
I'm not sure I would say I'm not recommending.
Because which ones would you recommend? Would you like?
Well, I think beyond the specifics, because some interventions they're very different in terms of how long you experience them, how long they're in your body. Ketamine versus LSD, for example. But I think what is much more important is the setting in which you are having that intervention. That to be guided by individuals in whom you deeply trust, because you're becoming exposed during that period of time.
Yeah.
That's the key. So this is anything but recreational. We're not discussing recreational, mushrooms or LSD at Burning Man or whatever it may be. I'm talking about the controlled administration of these molecules under the guidance of a highly trained group of people.
Does that include ayahuasca?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes.
There's not studies done with ayahuasca.
There are studies being done, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
The difference about with respect to ayahuasca is it's not as standardized and standardizable as it would be to have a specific LSD, ketamine, MDMA molecule. So ayahuasca, as you know, the components, the two major components that go into it, the way that you inhibit the enzyme for its digestion based upon one of its components, the source, it seemed to be a more natural approach because you're really taking it from the plant. But so therefore, though it's being studied, the ability to carry out a controlled study with ayahuasca is much more difficult.
Yeah. And you hear negative sides of what happens when people don't go to the right person. And so obviously you have to find the right people and all that stuff. You're saying the setting is really important there.
Yeah, but I'm excited by what I'm seeing in the literature, in good literature now, and the fact that it's transcended from fringe to appearing in mainstream literature. I think it's a very, very powerful tool and going to be even more so.
Do you experiment with psycho?
I haven't.
You haven't, or you're not able to say it? I don't know.
No. I mean, I've not experimented with it in a clinical setting, nor have I been ever exposed to it, at least for the past. College was a different time back then, and we maybe ventured into the cow pasture from time to time.
So. I figure you'd be so curious, just as as a brain expert, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. Well, my final question for you is, what do you see as the future of brain health, brain research? You've got all of these different paths with psilocybin studies being done. You have the tech side with AI. Where do you see all this going? And kind of what are some predictions you think that you can make?
I think that in my world of neurodegenerative diseases, it's currently being revolutionized as we speak. If you and I have a conversation in 1 year, there'll be a lot more to talk about. And it's the recognition that this is an immunometabolic issue across virtually any chronic degenerative neurologic problem that you could name. So, are you a lumper or a splitter? are you a splitter saying, well, we have Parkinson's here, and we have frontotemporal dementia here, and we have Alzheimer's there, and autism over here? Or are you a splitter, a lumper, saying, is there anything that is common, a commonality throughout these issues? And there is, and it's neurometabolism, immunometabolism. And I think now that the focus in our most well-respected institutions is getting that message, that it's not the accumulation of alpha-synuclein that causes Parkinson's or beta-amyloid that causes Alzheimer's disease, but it's what comes upstream of those issues, which is disturbances in brain metabolism. So now, beyond just the idea of targeting metabolism using these GLP-1 agonist drugs, we have to look at where is this metabolism fix most influential in charting that brain's destiny. And the fix is by targeting the immune cells in the brain. Where the future will go in the near term will be more aggressive approaches that target metabolism, but we're seeing things like gamma oscillation. In other words, exposing the brain, this is research at MIT right now, to light and sound at a specific frequency, 40 hertz. That's been shown to reprogram microglial cells to the good twin. Hyperbaric oxygen, to target the function of the mitochondria, the central player for metabolism, is now being finally recognized to being such an important player. And I think in the less near term, but within the next 5 years, the manipulation outside the body of cultured microglial cells with CRISPR technology to create microglial cells that are almost locked into being the good twin, and then infusing them, or vectors to change the genetic makeup of the microglial cells that are existing already in the brain with small molecules delivered by a particular vector.
Do you think Neuralink has any impact on brain health and all these things that could happen?
I do, and I think that we're going to see hopefully a lot more data to come out.
Hopefully soon, yeah. They just did the first human, right? Yeah, it's exciting times, honestly.
There's a lot to talk about in terms of really leveraging our current level of knowledge and targeting metabolism specifically to keep those neurons preserved.
Yeah.
But we'll see what happens with Neuralink. They have and have won already, so that's kind of exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe next year we'll have some more info and we can get you back.
You bet.
Awesome. Dr. Perlmutter, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you
for
having me.
Where can people find you, by the way, and where Brain Wars, obviously?
Brain Wars isn't out
yet, but
we got a ways to go on that. The trouble I'm finding is, as I'm writing the manuscript, every day there's new stuff coming out that I have to include this, and I'm asking, pretty soon I'm going to have to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, we send it off to the publisher, and now I keep my fingers crossed. But the best place to find me is drperlmutter.com.
Beautiful.
Yep.
Okay, well, we can't wait for the book. Appreciate it.
Nor can I.
Yeah. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. See you guys next time.